Hey guys, my name is Reese Alley. I own a company called Adams and Alley. We work with infrastructure companies doing 1 to 3 million and that are looking to scale. This is actually a rerun of the call that was last week, and I hadn't had a chance to edit it. And so here's kind of the condensed version of what it takes to leave your full-time job and go into business for yourself. So just getting into this, I'll have this in a small box in the upper screen. So who am I? I've been in the landscape/construction industry for a little while, since I was about 15, originally getting started cutting grass, I think as everybody does, and starting in general landscaping and moving into eventually what I work in now, which is stormwater infrastructure, doing dam reconstruction, culverts, stuff like that. But I've done a lot in between since, and currently we're doing a little over $4 million a year. Expectations. So this call is in a response to a gentleman that I was on the phone with a few weeks ago who was a mechanical engineer, and he was doing pretty well for himself, working at a firm with a pretty good job, pretty cushy, and making great money, had a great schedule, and he's been using his paid time off to do larger projects, doing weekend projects, and a lot of stuff in between, utilizing the equipment that he's got now. He's got a pretty good setup, which is very nice, and he wanted to know what it would take to leave his full-time job and have the security to go into business for himself and to support the family that he has. He's had a job his entire life, to my knowledge, and so going out on his own and his own business is a little bit of a stretch in terms of conceiving what needs to happen, and so I wanted to put this together to go over what sort of your business should look like. Everything's speculative until it's not, and so I don't want to paint the wrong picture that this is the only answer. These are very general calculations, but just something to give you a bearing for what you might have to expect. But to set some expectations, so you will be working a lot harder than your job, especially starting out. There is a time to where it will, cap off a little bit once you can afford management and things like that. But relative to having a W-2 job where you have a boss that's writing directions and you have a list of things to do, or maybe you can make your own schedule, but you're very flexible, that is not the case in small business, especially when you're 1 or 2 crews where you're the man, the myth, the legend. It's a lot of work. You're answering all the questions, you're answering all the job sites, you're answering every call, every beck, everything that comes along and comes into your way that needs to be answered. That could be situations in the job site, selling, marketing, accounting, finance, all that kind of stuff. It's all you. And so setting the expectation to work the 40 hours a week that you've always worked with your full-time job, that's just not the case. And you might be able to do that later on, even as an owner-operator, but you've got to be really choosy with your projects, and typically you have to be doing a larger scale. So just know, if you do make that jump originally, it's going to be a lot of work. So this example, this guy he's a mechanical engineer that's in his mid-30s. He's got a family, like I said. He's making about $140,000 a year pre-tax. He's a weekend warrior. His setup is a 7,000-pound excavator, 12,000-pound skid steer. It's a 2019 dually, and a 3,000-pound Kubota tractor and a trailer. He's only got about $2,200 a month in overhead, which is fantastic. That's a great place to start, and it's also low. But in his first year in business, he did about $90,000 a year. In his second year in business, he did about $150,000 a year. So currently, he's going on his third year and doing pretty well. Those are really strong numbers, especially for someone who currently has a full-time job. That's a great, great start. There's a lot of people that try and go out on their own that do those same numbers. So if you're able to do that on nights and weekends, those are really great numbers to start out with. Now, his setup, for example, I want to point out, the only thing that I would probably take out and sell is the 3,000-pound Kubota tractor. The stuff that he wanted to do, which is general excavation, grading, things of that nature, that's just not going to be something that's useful. I'm assuming that was purchased if he's got a little bit of land that he lives on, kind of as a maintenance vehicle, for example, but something that you're going to work with, that's just not really going to be adequate. With that kind of setup, he's got a truck, trailer, a skid, and an excavator. That is plenty. He was asking if he should buy a bigger machine or a different kind of machine or new attachments, this, that, and the other. And the reality is, with that exact same setup, you can easily make $40,000 or $50,000 a month with you and a few guys running a one-man show. If you're on bigger projects or more complex specialty projects, you might even be able to achieve closer to the 60s or 70s, but that is totally fine to get off the ground. And so I definitely wouldn't recommend buying anything else. I would do exactly what you can with the setup that you've got, especially since a lot of it's cash and you don't have very high payments. So these calculations are entirely speculative. There's a lot of different ways you can skin a cat, and there's 100 different ways your business can look and be making the same amount of money. You can have a business that's making $1,000 a month in profit, that could be doing $10,000. You could be having a $1,500 job with extremely high margins. And so there's a lot of different ways you can arrive at the same amount, but I think these are some really good general rules if you are looking for a benchmark. So he mentioned over the phone that he had a fear that he didn't have a year or two, and I quote, of work backed up and where he could eat off of if he were to leave his job. And I think that's really, really high. That's really not something that's too realistic on that scale of a company. Typically, people on that size, a really healthy backlog is 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes longer in the busy season. But if it gets down to 2 or 3 weeks, I promise you that's totally normal. When I was in that phase, I had to be operating between 0 and 3 weeks of backlog for quite a long time before it became consistent. And everybody that I've known that's gotten off the ground from scratch has experienced a pretty similar backlog. And even on the bigger scale, once you start doing 100,000, 200,000, right now we're running at about $350,000 or $400,000 a month, depending on the weather at this point, at this time of year. But it's very similar. Even on the big scale, we might have a couple $1 million of work sold, but we can't mobilize on nearly all of it at all. It might be, we can only mobilize on sometimes 10 to 20% of that actual number because there's a lot of politics involved in things like that. So just because it seems like it's a short period of time doesn't mean that it's not normal. As far as a monthly number, again, these are very speculative. These are very rounded off numbers. But if you were trying to pull $7,500 a month out of your business, roughly multiply that times 4, assuming a 25% net margin. And if he's got $2,200 a month in overhead, you just add 7% to that margin to get your gross margin. And that's what you'd be shooting for every month. Again, it's not going to be cut and paste. It's not going to be that simple. But talking about a benchmark to shoot from, 25% net margins are pretty normal if you're pricing things well and you understand how to estimate well. And so that'd be about $30,000 a month at a 32% net margin, or 32% gross margin for that to be accomplished. Free operating capital, it needs to be about $20,000. A good rule of thumb for a very safe business is if you were to have the amount of operating capital, and when I say that, that's a snapshot number. That's not a total gross. I mean, your cash flow is going to go up and down and up and down. And so if you were doing about $30,000 a month, you want to have at least 10,000, but if not more, like 15 to 20 of actual snapshot money in your account. And again, to reiterate that, that's if you were to pay, let's say you have $40,000 in your account and you have $10,000 at a vendor and $10,000 of payments coming up and $10,000 of payroll that week. Your snapshot at the end of that week would be all of those things minus the total number in the account. And that's how you get your snapshot. It's an easy, quick way to get an idea about how much money you actually have in your account and you actually have at the end of the day if everything were to stop, get paid, and even up tomorrow. So if you want to be on the good side, I'd say about 20,000, and then that will surge into the 30s. It'll go dip into the 10s, but you'll stay relatively healthy and you still got some money to spare. Monthly estimates. So starting out, your closing rate will be a little bit lower. I think 20% is a good benchmark to try and work towards. Currently I operate in the 30s, 40s, and 50th percentile as far as closing rates, depending on the size jobs. Higher the closing rate, the bigger the job. The lower the closing rate, the smaller the job, which is why, again, I try and shoot for bigger projects. I think it's a little bit easier to court customers. But in the beginning, when you're operating between like the 15, 20, and 30% closing rates, you would have to be doing about $150,000 a month to have that translate into the $30,000 a month that you need for a top line number. And so as that backlog gets larger and you're consistently doing that amount, stuff like the hundreds, the 200s, the $300,000 a month, you'll balloon up to the 300s one month. You might dip down to maybe the 80s per month, but as long as you're hitting that 150 per month number roundabout and you're confident in your closing rate, then you'll be able to have faith that you'll be able to be popping out $30,000 a month to work off of on the back end. if you're using subcontractors, you can just increase all these metrics by 25% and your closing rate will go down a little bit. Again, I know a lot of people that just use subs and their closing rate is just as high, but talking about from a lesser experienced standpoint, I think it's pretty reasonable to increase all of those metrics as far as the top line of estimates that you need to have out and the top line number you're producing to achieve the same profit at the end of the month, because your margin is going to go down just a little bit. Your ideal projects really need to be between $3,500 and $20,000. Again, if you're just getting started, $20,000 might seem like a little bit of a big project, but most of the time these can be accomplished in a week and a half or between 5 and 10 working days. And I feel like anything past that point, especially when you're doing sub $40,000 a month, is going to be pretty daunting. And if it's on one big project and it's a specialty project you know everything about, then maybe it's worth it. But your couple day jobs to 1 week jobs are going to be absolutely the best bet. They're easy to maintain margins. It's easy to see things that come up, and it's also very easy to plan ahead and get all your variables in order. And also, if it's a very weather-sensitive project, it's much easier to fit that into gaps of time where it makes sense instead of getting caught by the rain or caught by a vendor that can't supply something. It's much easier to not have anything horrible go wrong as you're gaining those skills of managing the projects. So also picking stuff that's within an hour of your area. I know it's really tantalizing to go an hour and a half, 2 hours, 3 hours for a big project. But realistically, if you're going to be the one on the job site and you still have to be back home doing estimates and things like that, it just doesn't make sense because there's so much windshield time unless you can price the job high enough to where it does make sense. You know, if a $10,000 project is 2 hours away and you can charge 15 or 16 grand for it and then make a little extra money on that windshield time and cover all of those expenses, then maybe it's worth it. But most of the time it's not. And then projects that can be done with your equipment, please avoid trying to buy a bunch of new equipment. And just because you get an invitation to do a project that you think, man, that $15,000 brush hog attachment would go great on this project, this is a perfect time to buy that. That's not always the case. Stick to your guns. Stay with stuff that you can operate with your equipment on. By doing things that you can use the same equipment you have, you unlock a huge advantage in the fact you don't have to increase your overhead. You can keep your margins good. You understand how to price these jobs. And worst case scenario, you can avoid if you buy something for one project and then you never have to use it again and it just sits at your shop and wastes away. So keep with the stuff you've got, stay true to it. I guarantee you it'll pay off in the long run. And if you sell a huge project or you know you're going to have 4 or 5 months of work for that piece of equipment, then it might be necessary. But at the end of the day, if again, you're just getting started, just getting off the ground, most of the time it is much better just to rent the piece of equipment, pay that amount of money as a pass-through cost that goes into the job, and then take your money home at the end of the day without the liability of having to have a payment going on and going on and going on. So assumptions. These are assumptions that I'm making when I'm doing these general calculations. Again, none of this is perfect, none of this is super specific, but this is assuming that no new overhead is added to the business, going off what I just said earlier about get the spider monkey food, which is what I've always been told, where you see a shiny object and you think, well, this is the perfect time to buy that, and when in reality it's not. You could have just rented it and made the same amount of money, if not more, and then not have the liability at the end of the day. No new major equipment. Don't buy anything for now. Just rent, make the money, and go home until you have enough cash to either put a sizable down payment or at least enough money in the bank to pay for those payments for a long time. And then you're working 70 to 80 hours a week. Talked about that before. It's necessary. You just got to do it for now. And then all the marketing efforts are done by you. I don't think this is the time to spend a lot of your money on advertising. I've done everything from social media, from Nextdoor, Facebook, LinkedIn, pay-per-click stuff on Google, and all of it's great, all of it works, but it's not the right thing to do, especially when you're a little bit newer to that space and you have limited funds to work with. And so all of the medias, all the posts, all the things and editing, whatever has to go into it, all of that should be being done by you specifically. Because one, you know what your business needs, you know what your customer is going to be looking for, and at the end of the day, you're not spending any money. It's sweat equity. That 70 to 80 hours a week, if you can fit 40 to 50 in for the actual work and another 20 or 30 in to actually build your business, your websites, your marketing, all that kind of stuff, that is going to pay dividends over time. And by the time it comes around where you can afford to have somebody help you with your marketing or posts or managing anything you need, the money will be in the bank, and you'll also understand how to tell them directions. If you never learn how to market yourself, then you'll never learn how to instruct anybody else how to market. It's the dichotomy of learning something first before you try and teach someone else how to do it or give them instructions, because they might have to know more than you, but if you don't know what to tell them, they're going to be running around like a chicken with their head cut off, and they're not going to know what to do, and you're going to be wasting your money. What you can do for free leads, like I was saying earlier, Nextdoor, Facebook, Google, door knocking in what's called the six-pack. If you're doing a project and let's say it's on this side of the street, you can always talk reasonably, even if it's a no solicitation neighborhood, which again, you can get around that anyways. But if you're at Johnny on the spot's house, and you can also go to the one beside him, the one next to him, and a few that are across the street reasonably and say, hey, we're doing a job for Johnny on the spot, and I would love it if we could give you an estimate, or if you have any requests to do the same kind of work, we'll be here on X date, and if you'd like anything else done in that time period, we could probably work out a discount if we could do them at the same time. Most of the time, they'll at least give you the chance for an estimate, and obviously that can lead to a job. But BNI groups, chamber groups, calling everyone you know and asking for referrals. If you have any, everyone's got family members, everybody has some amount of friends, just tell them what you're doing. If you really want to commit to the business and you really want to get yourself in a place where you can commit to what you're doing, then tell everybody you know, and they're going to help encourage you. They're going to give you referrals, and even if they can't do the job specifically, then they'll recommend you to someone that can, and it's just another form of free advertising. What my day looked like to that size? So I would typically leave the house at about 6:30 in the morning. I'd get fuel, pick up materials, go get the guys, texting the customer when I was going to be there, keeping them in the loop, and then getting to the site at around 8:30. A lot of times, if it was within 30 minutes-ish of the place I was getting materials that day, 8:30 is a pretty reasonable time, and if you're meeting subcontractors, typically they show up around 8 or 9 o'clock. Anyways, so I'd produce with the guys until about 11:30 or 12 every day. Typically, I'd go get them lunch, and then I would go do estimates for the rest of the day. And if you can win the day in the morning, it makes a big difference, and especially if your customer's working from home, a lot of time they will if you're in the middle of a project. And again, this is talking about homeowner stuff. I'm not talking about big commercial jobs. It's a very different world, but talking about homeowner residential jobs where most people are going to start, a lot of times they'll be home. This gives you time to walk them to the job site, explain any hardships that are coming up, and then keep them in the loop on what's going on so that way you can kind of take the bullets out of the gun before they get home and realize something wasn't the way they thought it was going to be. And then I go do 1 to 3 estimates a day in the evening. Typically this was after I got lunch and was on the phone with a couple people. I'd have like a 2 or a 3:30, sometimes a 4:30, and then I'd go back to the job site, and then I'd go home for the day and write all this stuff up and then repeat. But you'll typically get home around 5 or 6 if you don't stop back by the job site. That's pretty reasonable. And then again, you have to carve out some office time to write all this stuff up and get things back to people on a timely manner. What's going to make or break you? Communication, attitude, managing expectations. It's all huge. You can be the highest bidder on the job out of 3 people and win every single time if all of those things are in the right place. The guy that has a bad attitude, that's slow at answering the phone, doesn't text back, and takes a week to get an email returned, that guy's not going to win. In the same way is if you're coming up and you're tired, hungover, and you just don't want to be there, people can pick up on that stuff. So it's worth more than you think. Just come in with a good attitude, come in expecting to win the bid, expecting to work with the customer. $500 here and there is cheaper than lawsuits. I have unfortunately been involved in that world for really stupid reasons, as many people would say about their situations as well. But if you factor in a price to where you're just barely scraping by with as much money as you need to get by with the job, you're inevitably going to run into really tough situations. So if you're doing a $10,000 project and you're trying to make $2,000 or $3,000, let's say it's 3, and you're just really trying to cut it close on everything, trying to get the exact amount of days you'll have the rental, the exact amount of material, you have to budget that extra $1,000 or $500 just in case for when something comes up, the curveball in every single job. so you're not the guy doing change orders on ignorant, silly mistakes. Because customers can understand that even if they don't understand the construction process. They do know what is going to be BS and what's not. Also, it's better to be wealthy than right, even if there's going to be times where a customer is going to have a really unreasonable expectation, where something that's just totally in left field, but it just makes sense for you to do it anyways, because all of the explanation and talking and negotiating in the whole world is just going to make them more angry. And so if you come up where you have to use an extra $400 of gravel or an extra course of block or something like that, and most of the time it was something you missed, just foot the bill, make them happy. It's a lot cheaper than having to go into litigation and them not referring you or holding up a last check. It's just easier to write a check for it and get out with a smile. Reading a lot of people skills books, I do believe that things are 80% communication, 20% construction. Read people skills books. John Maxwell's got good stuff. Napoleon Hill, all that kind of thing really adds up to making the bottom line number bigger and keeping expectations real with your customers, and then also getting a lot of referrals. So that stuff matters more than you think, and just keep going with that. But risk to reward, just closing out, this stuff is real. Risk is a real thing. There was a time where it was the several years where I'd just gotten started where I was doing really well. I'll be very honest, I got very lucky in a lot of ways, and hard work aligned with opportunity, and everything went really well. I made pretty good decisions, and I really didn't think I could lose. And once I started scaling into the 70s, 80s, and hundreds per month is when everything started to crumble a little bit and things started falling apart. And I think a lot of that was because I thought I was bulletproof in a lot of ways. And to be honest, you're not, and you will lose eventually. If you're not losing on a small scale, you'll lose on a big scale. And I promise you, there are mistakes that you can make that are irreversible and take years to fix. And I can tell you that because I have been in that situation. But I think a lot of that highlights when times are good, and it keeps your expectations in check once you have to go through one of those dips. But understand, if you do well for 6 months, it doesn't mean you'll do well the next 6 months. So just keep your margins tight, keep your overhead as low as you can, and flexibility does come from keeping your debt low and profits high. Money is fuel, money is flexibility, money is opportunity. And if you constantly are running on a tiny margin where if anything ebbs or flows, then the whole thing snaps in half, that is a ticking time bomb, and I can promise you that. But either way, don't sacrifice your price. It's never worth it. But also, with all this stuff in mind, it may seem like a lot of doom and gloom, but I promise you, if you can get through these initial stages, it can be extremely rewarding. You can have a great life. There's a lot of people I know that have, stayed small and keep it all per se with 1 or 2 crews. Namely, a mentor that I had that I tried to buy his company. It didn't work out, but they have a dredging business. It's 2 guys. One of them is 65, the other is 68, and one of them does operations, one of them is sales and office kind of stuff, and they do 800 top line and net 450 last year. And when I say net, they took out $450,000 from the business. It wasn't a on paper thing. They extracted $450,000 off $800,000 of produced work. And they only worked a few months out of the year. Because now they've been in business for like 45 years or something crazy like that. And they pick the butter cake jobs off the top. They only take jobs that they specifically know how to do very, very well, and that they're one of a couple bidders, sometimes the only bidder. So that kind of stuff is possible. You don't have to grow some massive enterprise to do really well and have a great life. And I can promise you, once that comes time and you start figuring that stuff out, it'll all be worth it, and you'll never think to yourself, well, it was a struggle back then and I wish I hadn't done that. You'll never think that. So I can tell you, just keep going, keep pushing forward, and there's a lot of things you can do to gain advantages by just keep learning, keep growing. I'm going to try and put out some stuff that might help, and there's a lot of others that have good stuff as well, and absorb as much as you can and stay as humble as you can. So hope this helps. I'll see you in the next one.